Don't come this week. It's too much right now. That message arrived after I drove 3 hours with gifts for my grandson sitting beside me. I stayed in my car, staring at the house where I thought my family still wanted me. I had no idea my daughter-in-law had been telling everyone a completely different story about me for years. Then, 7 years later, her own mother called me and whispered, "I found the papers she never wanted you to see." But to understand what he told me, you need to hear the whole story. I appreciate you settling in with me for this one. One small thing before we start. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with something important? Only to find out they weren't who you thought they were, yes or no. I read every single one. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message at its core is what matters most. My daughter-in-law's text came through at 6:15 on a Friday evening, 14 words that landed like a door slamming shut while I was still standing on the porch. Don't come this week. It's too much right now. I read it 3 times. Sitting in my truck in the parking lot of Garrett's apartment complex in Allentown, engine still warm from the 45-minute drive from Bethlehem. I read those 14 words and tried to figure out which part of me was too much. The visit? The gifts? The grandfather who kept showing up even when the invitations had stopped coming. On the passenger seat sat 2 bags I'd been putting together for months. The first held a jewelry box I'd carved in my workshop from a piece of black walnut I'd been saving since before my wife died. Dovetail joints, hand-rubbed finish, a velvet lining I'd ordered from a craft supply catalog because Constance would have insisted on velvet. It was for my granddaughter, Wren, who had just turned 13. The second bag held a set of woodworking chisels for my son, Garrett, because he'd mentioned wanting to learn, and I'd been waiting 35 years for him to say that. Too much. She'd written too much, like I was a delivery she didn't order. I set the phone face down on my knee and looked up at the apartment. 2nd floor, 3rd window from the left. A silhouette moved behind the curtain. Someone crossing the living room in the kind of unhurried way that tells you they're home and comfortable and not expecting company. Then the porch light clicked off. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am 66 years old. I spent 36 years building custom furniture in a shop on Mechanic Street in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I raised 1 son, buried 1 wife, and retired with hands that still smell like sawdust no matter how many times I wash them. I am not a complicated man. I don't start trouble, and I don't go looking for it. But I have learned, in the hardest possible way, that trouble doesn't care whether you're looking for it or not. The text had come from Simone, my daughter-in-law, Garrett's wife. The woman who, more than 13 years earlier, had smiled at me across a hospital room while I held Wren for the first time and said, "She's going to be so lucky to have you." That was the version of Simone I'd carried in my head for years. The smiling young mother who seemed grateful and kind and just a little too polished for someone who'd married a man who still couldn't fold a fitted sheet. My wife, Constance, who could read people the way I read wood grain, had watched Simone at that first Thanksgiving and said 5 words I'd ignored for too long. Polish wears off, substance doesn't. Constance died a couple of years later, fast and merciless. She never got to see whether she was right about Simone. But she was right. She was right about everything. I sat in that parking lot and thought about the trust fund, the one I'd been building for 13 years, since the week Wren was born. I'd opened the account at Lehigh Valley Savings and Trust in Bethlehem and started making deposits every month. $2,000, sometimes more when a commission came in from a custom dining table or a restored church pew. 13 years of that. The balance had grown to a number I'd told exactly one person, my son Garrett, on the day I'd set it up. Building that trust fund was like building a piece of furniture nobody ordered. You shape it in silence, hoping someone will need it before the wood warps. You sand it and finish it and set it aside, and trust that one day the person you built it for will understand what it cost you. I'd told Garrett not to share the number. Don't tell anyone, I'd said. Money changes how people look at each other, he'd promised. Whether he'd kept that promise was something I wouldn't find out for another 5 months. The parking lot was getting dark. I looked at the apartment one more time. The porch light was off now, the window curtains still. Whoever had been moving inside had settled. I reached for the key in the ignition, and that's when I noticed it. Simone's car wasn't there. I scanned the lot. 12, maybe 15 cars. None of them the silver Accord she'd been driving since Garrett bought it for her 3 years ago. It wasn't in a visitor spot. It wasn't parked on the street. It simply wasn't there. She'd sent that text from somewhere else entirely. And somebody inside that apartment, somebody who wasn't my daughter-in-law, had just turned off the light. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at the empty spot where her car should have been. The jewelry box on the passenger seat caught the street light through the windshield, the black walnut glowing the way good wood does when you've finished it right. I'd spent 40 hours on that box. I'd driven 45 minutes to deliver it, and the woman who told me not to come wasn't even here. I didn't know it yet, but that missing car would be the first thread in something I'd spend the next 5 months unraveling. I drove home that night thinking about the missing car. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Bethlehem, I'd talked myself out of it. Maybe she'd parked around back. Maybe Garrett had dropped her off. People park in different spots. It wasn't a mystery. It was a Friday night, and I was a 66-year-old man looking for reasons to feel wronged. But to understand how I ended up in that parking lot holding gifts nobody wanted, you need to go back to where the money started. 13 years ago, my workshop on Mechanic Street, the week my granddaughter was born. I was sitting at my workbench desk, the one I'd built from reclaimed barn oak the year I opened the shop. Sawdust in the grain, linseed oil rubbed so deep the wood had turned the color of dark honey. I had a checkbook open, a new account number written on a deposit slip from Lehigh Valley Savings and Trust, and the smell of red oak shavings still hanging in the air from a dining table I'd finished that morning. The check was for $2,000, the first of many. My son, Garrett Stanton, stood in the workshop doorway holding his daughter like she was made of glass. He was 35, a branch operations manager at a regional insurance company in Allentown. And he had his mother's quiet temperament and his father's stubborn loyalty. Wren Stanton was 6 pounds and 11 ounces of furious newborn, and when I held her for the first time, something in my chest that had gone quiet since Constance's diagnosis woke back up. Every birthday, I told Garrett, tearing the check along the perforation. Every commission, until she's old enough to use it right. He shifted Wren to his shoulder and nodded. How much you starting with? Don't tell anyone the number, I said. Not even her mother someday. Money changes how people look at each other. I promise. Dad, this stays between us. I need you to hold on to this image. A grandfather writing a check at a sawdust-covered desk, because it matters for what happened to that money later. Every dollar that went into that account came from somewhere real. A custom hutch for a couple in Easton, a restored church pew for a Methodist congregation in Nazareth, a set of bookshelves for a lawyer's office that took me 3 weeks because he wanted quarter-sawn white oak and wouldn't settle for anything else. I built things with my hands, and the money those things earned went into an account with my granddaughter's name on it. That was the system. It was simple, and it was honest, and it worked for 4 years. Constance Stanton, my wife of 37 years, was an elementary school art teacher who could size up a person in one conversation and be right about them for the next 30. She taught watercolors and papier-mâché, and the kind of patience that only someone who spends decades with 9-year-olds can learn. She died of ovarian cancer in late September of 2021 on a Tuesday. And after that, the house went so quiet I could hear the hallway clock for the first time in 37 years. I kept building. I kept writing the checks. The trust was the only thing that still felt like it had a future attached to it. Garrett married Simone Prescott in the spring of 2022. She was 33, a CPA-credentialed bookkeeper with a warm handshake and a way of making spreadsheets feel like acts of care. She brought flowers to Constance's grave on their first anniversary, which is the kind of gesture that makes you decide someone is good before you've seen enough to know for sure. I liked her. I wanted to like her. After Constance, I needed someone in that family who made things feel organized and safe. But Constance had met Simone once, months before she died, at a Thanksgiving dinner where Garrett had brought her as his girlfriend. My wife watched Simone charm the table for 2 hours, then leaned over while I was drying dishes and said the same 5 words she'd say again years later. Polish wears off. Substance doesn't. I told myself Constance was being Constance, skeptical of new people, protective of Garrett. I filed it away and forgot about it. That was my first mistake. In the fall of 2021, not long after Constance's funeral, Simone, who had already been dating Garrett for over a year by then and had made herself a steady presence in the house, sat at my kitchen table one weekday evening going over a stack of my tax documents because I'd mentioned I was behind. She looked up from her laptop and said something that sounded like kindness. "Let me handle the statements and the filings. It's literally what I'm trained for. You shouldn't have to worry about paperwork at your age." At your age. I didn't hear it then, the way you don't hear a floorboard creak until the whole staircase gives way. But looking back, that was the first time she framed me as someone to be managed instead of respected. Have you ever handed someone the keys to something you built with your own hands and felt relief instead of warning? That's what it felt like. I told her to go ahead and handle the statements and the filings, and Simone thanked me with a smile that made me feel taken care of. I never signed anything. I never thought I needed to. It was the last time I thought I understood what was happening to that trust. By the time Garrett and Simone married in the spring of 2022, she'd been handling my paperwork for months, and the quarterly statements had already started arriving a little later than they used to. I didn't know it at the time, but that weekday evening was the last honest conversation I ever had about Wren's trust fund. By the time the Sunday calls stopped in April of 2024, Simone had been managing and quietly draining that account for years. Have you ever noticed the exact moment someone stopped picking up the phone for you? Or did it happen so gradually you only recognized it looking back? For me, it started in April of 2024. Garrett and I had kept a standing Sunday evening call since Wren was born, 12 years of it, regular as church. I'd call at 7. He'd pick up by the second ring, and we'd talk for 20 minutes about nothing important. The kind of conversation that only matters because it keeps happening. Then one Sunday in April, the phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. An hour later, a text came back. "Sorry, Dad, crazy day, talk later." I called the next Sunday. Voicemail again. This time the text came from Simone's phone, not Garrett's. Wren picked up something at school, maybe next weekend. The weekend after that, Simone texted again. "Garrett's working a double. Rain check? 3 Sundays in a row. 3 cancellations. And here's the thing I noticed but talked myself out of noticing every excuse came from Simone's phone. Not once did Garrett send the text himself. I told myself she was the family scheduler, the one who kept the calendar, the one who managed the logistics of a household with a busy 12-year-old. That's what I told myself, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to think about yet. That's how it works when someone turns down the thermostat on your life 1 degree at a time. You don't notice the cold until your hands are already numb. I went from seeing Wren every 2 weeks to seeing her once a month, then once every 6 weeks. Each cancellation had a reason. Each reason made sense on its own. It was only when I sat down one evening and counted them, 6 rescheduled visits in 10 weeks, that the shape of it started to look less like busy and more like deliberate. But I was 66 years old, and I'd buried my wife 2.5 years earlier, and my son was the only family I had left besides Wren. I wasn't going to be the difficult father who read conspiracy into scheduling conflicts. Busy is what 35 looks like, I told myself, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday night with the phone dark on the counter. My own father said the same thing advice. Then Vernon said something I should have listened to. Vernon Caldwell was 68, a retired compliance officer who'd spent 30 years at Lehigh Valley Savings spotting suspicious transactions the way I could spot a joint cut a 64th of an inch too wide. He was the closest thing I had to a best friend, a widower like me, and we'd been meeting at the same diner on Broad Street in Bethlehem every other Wednesday since we both retired. He drank his coffee black. He never ordered dessert, and he had a habit of being right about things I didn't want to hear. I told him about the missed calls, the rescheduled visits, the texts that always came from Simone's phone. He set his mug down and looked at me across the booth with that expression he got when he was about to say something I'd argue with. Gene, when somebody controls who gets to see the books and who gets to see the grandchild, that's not scheduling, that's a perimeter. She's managing a household with a busy 12-year-old, I said. You're reading crime into calendar conflicts. I'm reading 30 years of watching people move money and move people. The pattern's the same. First, you limit access. Then, you limit information. Then, by the time anyone notices, the window's already closed. I want you to remember Vernon's exact words, because in about 6 months, I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office wishing I had. But that day in the diner, with the plates clattering around us and the afternoon light coming through the window and my coffee getting cold, I shook my head and told him he was being dramatic. She's a CPA, Vernon. She organizes things for a living. That doesn't make her a criminal. I didn't say criminal, he said. I said perimeter. Call me back in 6 months and tell me I was wrong. I'll buy lunch. I drove home annoyed. Not at Vernon exactly, but at the feeling his words had left in my chest, like a splinter I couldn't see but could feel every time I pressed on it. I pulled into the driveway and went inside and put my keys on the counter next to a stack of mail I'd been ignoring for a week. The quarterly trust statement was in that stack. I recognized the envelope from Lehigh Valley Savings, the same format they'd been sending since I opened the account. But something made me pick it up and turn it over. The postmark was dated 3 weeks earlier than usual. No, that wasn't right. The statement itself was 3 weeks late. It should have arrived at the beginning of the month. It had come at the end. I stood at my kitchen counter, holding that late envelope, and for the first time I didn't open it. I set it on the stack with the others and told myself I'd look at it tomorrow. Tomorrow turned into a week, and the week turned into forgetting, which, I'd learn later, was exactly what she was counting on. I did eventually open that statement, not the next day, not even that week, but on a rainy Tuesday in October of 2024 when I ran out of reasons not to. I brought the whole stack to my desk, 4 quarterly envelopes I'd let pile up like homework from a class I was failing, and started reading them the way I used to read wood grain slowly, looking for the flaw. I found it on the oldest one in the stack, a statement from June of 2020, more than 4 years earlier. A single withdrawal for $340, labeled Administrative Processing. I remembered seeing it back then. I remembered asking Simone about it on the phone, and I remembered her answer like it was yesterday. It's just an admin fee. Gene, she'd said, with that particular patience she used when she thought I didn't understand something. The bank charges them once in a while for trust accounts, nothing to worry about. I'd believed her. She had the credentials, she had the tone. And I had no reason to think a woman who brought flowers to my wife's grave would lie to me about $340. But sitting at my desk in the rain-streaked light of that October afternoon, I did something I should have done 4 years earlier. I pulled every quarterly statement I had and looked for the same fee on any of them, every page, every line item, from the day I'd opened the account to the present, It wasn't there. Not once. Not on any other statement in 13 years. I need you to understand what that number meant in this story, not as a dollar amount, but as permission. A fee that appears once and never again isn't a fee. It's a test. Someone moved $340 out of my granddaughter's trust fund, called it something official sounding, and waited to see if I'd push back. I didn't push back. I accepted the explanation from a woman with a CPA credential and a warm smile. And that acceptance told her everything she needed to know about what she could get away with next. I sat at that desk for a long time after that, listening to the rain hit the window and thinking about Vernon's words in the diner. The perimeter, the controlled access. I still wasn't ready to say he was right, but I wasn't able to say he was wrong anymore either. Then there was Wren. This was a month before I opened those statements, back in September. Simone had finally agreed to a visit, a Saturday afternoon at Cedar Creek Park in Allentown, the kind of outing that felt supervised even though nobody called it that. Wren was 12, tall for her age, with my wife's dark eyes and a directness that came from somewhere I couldn't trace. We sat on a bench near the playground while Simone stood 30 feet away, pretending to look at her phone. Children are terrible at keeping secrets, not because they talk too much, but because they haven't learned yet which truths the adults around them are trying to bury. Wren was swinging her legs against the bench slats, telling me about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, when she stopped mid-sentence and said something that lodged in my chest like a nail. "Grandpa, Mommy and Daddy were really loud about your papers. Daddy said it wasn't right." I looked at her. "My papers?" "The ones in Mommy's desk. Daddy found them, and they were yelling. He said it wasn't right, and Mommy said he didn't understand." Before I could ask another question, Simone was there. I hadn't seen her move, but suddenly she was standing beside the bench with her hand on Wren's shoulder, and the phone was gone. "Wren, honey, go try the big swings. I'll push you. Go on." Wren looked at me, then at her mother, and slid off the bench. Simone watched her go, and then she looked at me, not at me, exactly, past me. The way people do when they're not redirecting a child, they're redirecting a conversation. "Kids pick up on everything," she said, smiling. "Garrett and I had a disagreement about some filing. You know how it is." I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. My granddaughter was 20 feet away, pumping her legs on a swing set, and the woman standing next to me had just shut down the most important thing anyone had said to me in months, without raising her voice or breaking eye contact. If your own son knew something wasn't right, why didn't he pick up the phone and tell you? I drove home from that park with Wren's voice playing on a loop in my head. Daddy said it wasn't right. My son knew. He knew something was wrong with those papers, and he hadn't told me. I thought about every unanswered Sunday call, every text that came from Simone's phone instead of his. And I understood for the first time that my son's silence wasn't neglect. It was something else. Something that had a shape I couldn't see yet but could feel pressing against the walls of everything I thought I knew about my family. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't what Simone had done, it was why Garrett had let her. The answer would come at a Thanksgiving table 2 months later, in a look on another woman's face that told me everything Garrett wouldn't. Thanksgiving answered the question Garrett wouldn't. Not with words, not with a phone call, but with a fork that stopped moving and a woman I barely knew telling me something I hadn't asked. Thanksgiving has always been the one holiday where you can't hide behind a phone screen. Everyone's at the same table, and the things people aren't saying take up more room than the food. I drove to Allentown that afternoon with a pecan pie from the bakery on Main Street and a card for Wren with a $50 bill inside. Garrett met me at the apartment door, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with cooking. Simone was behind him in the kitchen, an apron over a dress that looked like it cost more than the turkey, moving between the stove and the counter with the kind of energy that makes everything look effortless and nothing feel relaxed. Wren ran to me and hugged my legs before I'd even set the pie down. The table was set for 5. Simone's mother was already seated. Lorraine Prescott was 61, a retired dental office receptionist who'd raised Simone alone after her first husband left when Simone was 4. She had careful eyes, the kind that come from decades of noticing things she wished she hadn't. And she sat very straight in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for a dental appointment instead of a family dinner. I'd met her twice before at holidays, and both times she'd been pleasant, quiet, the kind of guest who helps with the dishes and leaves before dessert. I want you to watch Lorraine the way I watched her that night, because this woman will matter more than anyone in this story before it's over. Dinner started well enough. Wren talked about her science teacher and a field trip to a nature center where she'd held a corn snake. Garrett carved the turkey with the same careful hands his mother used to tease him about. Simone poured wine and told a story about a client at her bookkeeping firm who'd tried to write off a swimming pool as a home office expense. Everyone laughed. It was warm, and it was loud, and it almost felt like the family I remembered. Then I made the mistake of being honest. I was thinking about adding another deposit for Wren's birthday next month, I said, reaching for the cranberry sauce. How's the account looking, Simone? Simone didn't miss a beat. It's growing nicely, Gene. I'll send you the latest summary next week. Her voice was steady, her smile was steady, everything about her was steady. But her mother stopped breathing for about 3 seconds, and I was the only one watching. Lorraine's fork was halfway to her mouth when I mentioned the trust. It froze there, suspended over her plate. And then she set it down carefully beside her napkin and didn't pick it up again. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Simone. She looked at her plate, the way someone looks at a spot on the floor when they're trying not to faint. Guilt has a posture. It sits lower in the chair. It eats less. It leaves the room before anyone asks it a question. And Lorraine Prescott spent the rest of that Thanksgiving dinner slowly sinking into her seat like a woman trying to disappear from a table she couldn't leave. I watched her for the next hour. She spoke only when spoken to. She moved food around her plate without eating it. When Simone asked if she wanted more wine, Lorraine shook her head without looking up. Garrett noticed nothing, or pretended not to. Simone noticed me noticing, and for one brief moment our eyes met across the table, and something passed between us that I couldn't name but could feel, like the static charge before a summer storm. The evening wound down the way these things do. Wren fell asleep on the couch. Garrett started wrapping leftovers. Simone walked me to the door with the pecan pie plate I'd brought, washed and dried and handed back like a receipt. But in the hallway, between the apartment door and the elevator, Lorraine caught me. She must have slipped out behind me while Simone was in the kitchen, because suddenly she was there, standing under the fluorescent hallway light in her good Thanksgiving blouse, and her hand was on my forearm. Not a casual touch, a grip. "I don't know anything about any of that, Eugene," she whispered. "I just want you to know that." I looked at her hand on my arm. It was shaking. "I didn't ask you if you did, Lorraine." She held my gaze for a moment. And in that moment, I saw something I recognized from 37 years of marriage to a woman who could read people like blueprints. Lorraine's mouth was saying one thing. Her eyes were begging me to keep looking. Then she let go of my arm, turned around, and walked back into the apartment without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I stood alone in that hallway, smelling her floral perfume and the leftover warmth of a Thanksgiving dinner that had just turned into something else entirely. Nobody tells you they don't know something unless they're terrified you'll figure out they do. I drove home on Route 378 with the heater running and Lorraine's whisper sitting in the passenger seat like a second person. Her hand had been shaking when she grabbed my arm, and people whose hands shake aren't telling you the truth. They're telling you they wish they could. 5 months would pass before I understood what Lorraine Prescott had been carrying, and by then, the visits had nearly stopped completely. Those 5 months after Thanksgiving taught me something about Lorraine's whisper. She hadn't been warning me, she'd been rehearsing, practicing the sentence she'd need if anyone ever asked. But I didn't have time to chase Lorraine's secret yet, because by January, the visits had all stopped. In January, I started keeping a list. Dates on the left, excuses on the right. I bought a pocket notebook from the hardware store on Broad Street, the kind with a leather cover and lined pages. And I kept it next to my truck keys so I'd see it every morning. Every time Simone sent a cancellation, I wrote it down. January 14th. Wren's got a cold, don't want to spread it. February 9th. Wren's got a school project all weekend, bad timing, Jean. March 19th. Wren has a friend's birthday party, already committed. Every excuse came from Simone's phone, every single one, in 4 months. Garrett didn't send me a single text, make a single call, or write a single word. It was as if my son had been removed from the conversation entirely, and the only voice left was the one deciding whether I got to see my granddaughter. If you've ever written down the dates someone made excuses not to see you, you already know. The list tells a story the individual reasons never do. Each cancellation, taken alone, was perfectly reasonable. A sick child, a work trip, a birthday party. But 11 cancellations in 4 months, all from the same phone, all in the same patient tone, all ending with, "Let's try next month," that wasn't a calendar problem. That was a wall being built one brick at a time. I managed one visit in that entire stretch, one afternoon in late February at a McDonald's near the highway, for 45 minutes. Simone sat 3 booths away, scrolling her phone, while Wren ate chicken nuggets and told me about a book she was reading. When the 45 minutes were up, Simone appeared at the table with her keys already in her hand and said, "We need to get going. Wren has homework." It was a Saturday. By April point, the notebook page was full. I sat at my kitchen table and counted the entries. 11 cancellations, 1 supervised visit, 0 phone calls from my son. I closed the notebook and called Vernon. He didn't seem surprised. He poured me coffee in his study, that small room at the back of his house with the mantel clock that ticked like a heartbeat and the bookshelves lined with 3 decades of banking compliance manuals. And he listened to me read the list aloud. When I finished, he took off his reading glasses and set them on the arm of his chair. 6 months, he said. What? I told you to call me in 6 months and tell me I was wrong. It's been 11. You owe me lunch. I didn't laugh. He didn't expect me to. How do you steal 13 years of a man's savings without him noticing? You make sure he never sees the real numbers. Vernon asked me one question that changed everything. When was the last time you saw a statement that didn't pass through her hands first? I opened my mouth to answer and nothing came out. I thought about those quarterly envelopes. The trust summaries Simone mailed me every 3 months, neatly typed, the balance growing steadily, everything looking exactly the way it should. I'd never questioned them because they looked professional and the numbers went up and she was a CPA who'd volunteered to handle the paperwork. Every statement I've seen came from Simone, I said. She mails them to me in a manila envelope. Then you've never seen the real one, Vernon said. Not once in 13 years. You've seen what she wanted you to see. The mantel clock ticked 3 times before I could speak again. What do I do? Walk into the bank yourself. Lehigh Valley Savings. You're the account originator. Bring your ID and your account number and ask for a full independent statement. Every transaction since the day you opened it. Don't tell Simone, don't tell Garrett. Don't tell anyone. Just go. Vernon looked at me the way Constance used to when I was being stubborn about something obvious, with patience that was running low and affection that hadn't. He walked me to the door and put his hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it felt less like comfort and more like the push you give someone standing at the edge of a pool who won't jump. "Jean," he said, "if I'm wrong, You'll see a healthy account and we'll never talk about it again. But if I'm right, you need to know before she figures out you're looking. I left Vernon's house that evening with a plan I'd never imagined needing. To walk into the bank where I'd opened my granddaughter's trust fund and ask to see numbers my daughter-in-law might have been hiding from me for years. I made the appointment from my truck in Vernon's driveway, Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, with an account officer. I didn't sleep well the night before, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, because part of me still hoped I'd walk in and find everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Every dollar accounted for, every statement accurate, every suspicion wrong. What the bank told me the next morning made sure I never hoped that again. Tuesday morning came, and I drove to the bank the way you drive to a doctor's appointment when you're not sure you want the diagnosis. Hands steady on the wheel, stomach somewhere around my knees, and a post-it note with my account number stuck to the dashboard because I didn't trust my memory with the way my head was spinning. I walked into Lehigh Valley Savings and Trust at 9:14 with my driver's license in one hand and that crumpled post-it in the other. And the woman behind the desk smiled at me like nothing was about to change. Gloria Hewitt was a senior account officer who'd been handling trust accounts at that branch for 15 years. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the careful, measured tone of someone trained to deliver bad news without editorializing. She shook my hand, asked me to sit down, and pulled up Wren's trust on her computer screen with a few keystrokes. "I'd like a full, independent statement," I said. "Every transaction since the account was opened. I haven't seen the actual bank records in a while." She nodded like this was a normal request. Maybe it was. Maybe grandfathers walked in every week asking to see accounts they'd built with their own hands because they had a feeling something wasn't right. She typed for a minute, scrolled, typed again, and then her fingers stopped moving. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Stanton, I want to make sure I'm pulling the correct account. You are the original depositor on this trust." "Yes." "And you're aware that primary decision-making authority was transferred in September of 2021 via a financial power of attorney?" The room went very still. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone in the lobby coughed. "A what?" "A financial power of attorney, signed by you, granting primary authority over the trust to a Simone Prescott. All transactions since September 2021 have been authorized under that document." September 2021, the month my wife was dying in hospice on the other side of town. The month I wasn't looking at paperwork because I was learning how to say goodbye to the woman I'd loved for 37 years. The month Simone had apparently walked into this bank or mailed in a form with my name on it. And nobody had called me to verify because the signature looked close enough. "I never signed a power of attorney," I said. Gloria Hewitt's expression didn't change. She'd been doing this too long to react. But her hand moved to the printer, and she pressed a button without looking away from me. "I'm going to print that document for you, Mr. Stanton." The printer hummed behind her desk. She retrieved the page, slid it into a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it in front of me the way you'd place something fragile on a table. "I want you to imagine looking at your own name on a document you've never touched and understanding in that single moment that someone in your family spent 4 years using it to take from a child." The signature was close, I'll give her that. The letters were the right size, the spacing was right, the general shape was right, but the E leaned too far to the right. I've been writing that E for 66 years, and mine stands straight. And the loop on the S was too tight, pinched in a way mine never is because I learned cursive from a woman who believed in wide, generous loops. My wife. My wife, who was dying in a hospice bed while this document was being filed. I set the plastic sleeve down on Gloria's desk and pressed my fingers flat against the surface to keep my hands from shaking. "How many transactions have been made under this authorization?" Gloria scrolled through the screen. The numbers moved past her glasses in a reflection I could see from across the desk. She scrolled for a long time. "There have been numerous withdrawals over the past 4 years," she said, "each one categorized as a routine maintenance withdrawal." She paused, choosing her words. "The individual amounts vary, but they're consistently below the threshold that would trigger an automatic internal review. Every withdrawal cut just thin enough to slide under the wire. The way a carpenter would shave a board 1/8 of an inch at a time until the whole thing is too narrow to hold any weight. She hadn't been sloppy. She'd been precise. She'd studied the system's limits and stayed just beneath them, month after month, for 4 years. "How much is left?" I asked. Gloria looked at the screen, then back at me. "I think it would be best if I printed the full statement for you, Mr. Stanton." She printed it. 4 pages. I didn't read them in her office. I thanked her, shook her hand, took the plastic sleeve and the statement pages, and walked through the lobby and out the front door into a May morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I sat in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine off, holding a photocopy of a signature that looked almost like mine. Almost. The E leaned too far right. The S was too tight. Details nobody would catch unless they'd spent 66 years writing that name. I knew 2 things sitting in that lot. My daughter-in-law had forged my signature to take control of my granddaughter's trust fund, and every quarterly statement she'd mailed me for 4 years, every manila envelope with the typed numbers showing a healthy, growing balance, had been a lie. 5 months later, I'd be sitting in another parking lot in Allentown, reading a text that said I was too much trouble. And this time I'd understand exactly why she wanted me gone. So now you have the full picture. The forged power of attorney filed while my wife was dying. The doctored statements mailed to my kitchen for 4 years. The withdrawals shaved thin enough to avoid the bank's own safeguards. And 5 months after I walked into Lehigh Valley Savings and saw my name in someone else's handwriting, a 14-word text telling me not to come. 5 months passed between the day I saw that forged signature and the evening Simone texted me to stay away. And now I'm going to tell you what connected them. I'd spent those 5 months doing nothing. That's the part I'm not proud of. After the bank visit in May, I'd driven home with the photocopy of the forged POA folded in my jacket pocket and the 4-page statement on the passenger seat. And I'd sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours trying to figure out what a 66-year-old retired cabinet maker does when he discovers his daughter-in-law has been stealing from his granddaughter. I didn't call Garrett. I didn't call the police. I didn't call anyone. I put the papers in my desk drawer and I waited, because I told myself I needed to think. What I actually needed was to stop being afraid of what would happen to my family if I said it out loud. By October, Simone had figured out I'd gone to the bank. I never learned exactly how. Maybe the branch sent a notification. Maybe she had alerts set up on the account. Maybe she simply felt the ground shift, the way people who are hiding something always do, the way a deer lifts its head a full second before you step on the twig. However she knew, and the text was her response. I told you at the beginning of this story that those 14 words were never about a busy Tuesday. Now you understand what they were really about. She wasn't canceling a visit. She was making sure the man who'd walked into her bank didn't get close enough to start asking questions in person. The missing car. The porch light going dark. The careful wording that reduced me to an inconvenience. It was all a perimeter check. Vernon's word. He'd been right about that, too. I sat in that Allentown parking lot for 40 minutes, not because I was hurt anymore, because I was deciding what kind of man I was going to be about this. The kind who drives to his son's apartment and puts the forged document on the kitchen table and watches it blow up. Or the kind who folds it back into his pocket and does this right. The next morning, Saturday, I drove to Vernon's house. He was in his study with reheated coffee and the mantel clock ticking its slow heartbeat. I laid everything out. The POA with the forged signature. The 4 pages of transactions I still hadn't fully read, the rejection text and its timing. Vernon listened without interrupting, which is how I knew it was bad, because Vernon interrupts everything. When I finished, he sat quiet for a long time, long enough for the clock to tick through what felt like a full minute. What do you do when the person who forged your name is married to your only son and raising your granddaughter? What do you do when the truth will break your family apart? And the silence is already breaking it a different way. This isn't a family argument anymore. Gene, Vernon said, this is forgery. You need a lawyer who handles trust fraud, and you need one before she figures out you know. She already knows I went to the bank. She knows you went. She doesn't know what you found. There's a difference, and that difference is the only advantage you have right now. I looked at the photocopy on his desk. My name, written by someone else's hand. Every part of me wanted to drive to that apartment and put those papers on Garrett's kitchen table and watch Simone try to explain a signature I never made. And that's exactly what she's expecting you to do, Vernon said, reading my face. The man who reacts first loses. The man who gathers everything first wins. 36 years of building furniture taught me one thing that applied here. You measure twice, you cut once, and you never rush a joint that has to hold weight. If I confronted Simone now, she'd have time to destroy records, coach Garrett, prepare a story. If I waited, gathered every piece of evidence, and walked into a lawyer's office with an airtight case, she'd have nothing. Vernon tore a piece of paper from a legal pad on his desk and wrote a name in his careful block letters. He slid it across to me the way Gloria Hewitt had slid the forged POA, and I thought about how much of this story had happened across desks, with documents passing between people who were about to change my life. Ramona Finch, Elder Law and Trust Litigation, Broad Street, Bethlehem. She's the best I know, Vernon said. But once you walk into her office, Gene, there's no walking it back. You understand that. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket next to the photocopy of my own forged name. 2 pieces of paper. One that proved what had been done to my family, and one that might be able to fix it. I called Ramona Finch Monday morning at 8:01 before I could change my mind. What she found when she pulled the trust's full transaction history made the forged signature look like the smallest part of what Simone had done. Ramona Finch's office was in a converted Victorian on Broad Street, the kind of building that used to be someone's home and still felt like it, with dark wood bookshelves and a staircase that creaked on the 3rd step. I walked in that Monday morning with a manila folder full of evidence and the particular feeling of a man who has finally stopped pretending everything is fine. Ramona Finch was 52, ran an elder law and trust litigation practice, and had a reputation in Bethlehem for making financial predators regret ever picking up a pen. She was compact, direct, and wore reading glasses she never took off, even when she wasn't reading. She shook my hand, pointed me to a chair across from her mahogany desk, and said one word: everything. So I gave her everything. The forged POA in its plastic sleeve, the 4 pages of transactions from Gloria Hewitt, the fabricated quarterly statements Simone had been mailing me, the pocket notebook with 11 cancellations logged in my handwriting, Vernon's analysis, the rejection text, the timeline, all of it, laid across her desk like the pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling in the dark for 6 months. Ramona didn't interrupt. She read each document, set it down, read the next. When she finished, she placed her hands flat on the desk and looked at me with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor surprised. It was professional, the kind of look you give someone whose case you've already decided to take. Mr. Stanton, if this signature is confirmed forged, your daughter-in-law didn't just manage your trust, she stole your identity to do it. Every withdrawal authorized under that POA is a separate act of fraud committed in your name. Hiring a lawyer to investigate your own family feels like calling a building inspector on a house you built with your own hands. You already know something's wrong, but hearing it confirmed makes the walls feel less solid. I sat in that leather chair and listened to Ramona make 2 phone calls. The first was to Lehigh Valley Savings, requesting the original POA document under a legal preservation notice. The second was to a forensic handwriting examiner she kept on retainer, a specialist who'd testified in over 40 fraud cases in the Lehigh Valley. 2 weeks, Ramona said after she hung up. The examiner needs the original document, your known signature samples, and time to run a full analysis. And in those 2 weeks, you talk to nobody, not your son, not Simone, not her mother. Can you do that? I've been doing it for 5 months. Good. Then 2 more weeks won't kill you. They nearly did. 14 days of sitting in my house in Bethlehem knowing what I knew and not being able to say it. 14 days of Simone's texts going unanswered because I'd been told not to respond. 14 days of looking at the workshop where I'd written the first check and wondering how many of those dollars were already gone. On day 15, Ramona called me back in. The forensic examiner's report was on her desk, bound in a blue cover with a clinical title I don't remember and a conclusion I'll never forget. I want you to understand what high probability means in a forensic examiner's report. It means they'd stake their career on it. And courts have convicted people on less. The examiner's conclusion is definitive, Ramona said. This is not your handwriting. The stroke pressure is inconsistent with your known samples. The letter formation, particularly the uppercase E and the loop structure on the S, shows a different motor pattern entirely. The baseline angle is off by 4 degrees. None of it matches. The E that leaned too far right, the S with the pinched loop. I'd noticed those details in the bank parking lot 5 months ago. Sitting alone with a photocopy and a sick feeling in my stomach. Now a professional with 40 court appearances was saying the same thing in language a judge would accept. But that wasn't the part that hit hardest. Ramona opened a second folder. She'd used her legal authority to pull a preliminary transaction summary directly from the bank, bypassing anything Simone had touched. She slid it across the desk. I want you to be prepared for what you're about to see. Every single withdrawal was cut just below the amount that would have triggered an automatic review. She knew the threshold, and she stayed under it every time. Lot after month, for 4 years, each transaction dressed up as routine maintenance or administrative processing or educational disbursement. Dozens of them. The same quiet, precise pattern. Like someone emptying a room, one piece of furniture at a time, so you don't notice the house is bare until you try to sit down. I looked at the number at the bottom of that page. I'd spent 13 years building that trust, one commission at a time, one birthday check at a time, one overtime payment at a time. She'd taken most of it the same way. One withdrawal at a time, each one small enough that nobody raised a flag. All of them together large enough to gut a child's future. Ramona closed the folder. The traffic on Broad Street hummed through the window. She looked at me across her desk with those reading glasses steady on her face. We have enough to move forward, she said. The question now is whether your son is going to be on your side of this or hers. I was about to find out. That same week, Ramona's office called Garrett to ask about trust documents, and the first crack in his marriage opened on a phone line he didn't know was coming. Ramona's paralegal made the call on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, I had a voicemail from my son that sounded like a man who just noticed the floor under his feet wasn't solid. The call came while Garrett was still at his desk at the insurance office in Allentown. A paralegal from Ramona Finch's firm, polite and procedural, requesting documentation related to Wren Stanton's education trust, that all. No accusations, no details, just a request for records, but it was enough. Garrett told me what happened next. He came home that evening, set his briefcase on the kitchen counter, and asked Simone a simple question. Someone from a law office called me today about Wren's trust. Why would a lawyer be asking me about Dad's trust fund? Simone was chopping vegetables at the counter. She didn't look up. It's probably just routine. Everything's with the bank. Garrett waited. Actually, I think I left copies of some documents at Mom's house, from when your father and I set up the admin access. Garrett waited longer. Your father signed off on all of it years ago. Garrett, it's fine. I don't know why a lawyer would be calling. 3 answers in 5 minutes. That's not confusion. That's a wall coming down one brick at a time while the person behind it tries to hold the rest in place. The paperwork was with the bank. No, it was at her mother's. No, it didn't matter because I'd signed everything. Each answer contradicted the one before it, and each one came a little faster, a little less polished. The way lies do when the person telling them starts running out of rehearsed material. Garrett didn't argue. He didn't press. He told me later, sitting at my kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood like he needed something solid under him, that he'd just gone to bed without saying goodnight. First time in 3 years of marriage. 3 different answers, he said, in 5 minutes. That's when I knew something was wrong. I sat across from my son and didn't tell him about the forged POA. I didn't tell him about the forensic examiner's report or the withdrawal summary in Ramona's office. Ramona had been clear. Not yet. Not until we have every piece in place. Let the paralegal call do its work. Let the cracks open on their own. It was the hardest silence of my life. My son was sitting in my kitchen telling me his marriage was splitting apart, and I knew why, and I couldn't say it. I want you to remember Lorraine's hand on my arm at Thanksgiving, because what I was driving toward that evening would change the shape of everything that came after. After Garrett left, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet the way it always was, the clock in the hallway ticking the way it had since Constance died. And I thought about Lorraine Prescott standing in that apartment hallway weeks earlier, grabbing my forearm and telling me she didn't know anything with hands that told me she'd everything. Lorraine wasn't Simone. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't polished. She was a 61-year-old retired receptionist who'd raised her daughter alone and spent the last 4 years carrying a secret that was eating her alive. I'd seen it at Thanksgiving. The frozen fork, the averted eyes, the whispered denial nobody had asked for. Guilt doesn't have a schedule, but it has an expiration date, and Lorraine's had been approaching for months. Vernon had told me not to tip my hand, but Lorraine wasn't a card to play. She was a person carrying something she didn't want to carry anymore, and I was the only one who'd noticed. How long can a mother keep her daughter's secret when keeping it means watching a family burn down from the inside? I picked up my truck keys from the counter, next to the pocket notebook that still held 11 cancellation dates in my handwriting, and I walked out to the driveway. Route 22 East to Easton. 15 minutes. Long enough to rehearse what I'd say, not long enough to talk myself out of it. The drive was dark and cold. November air through the cracked window. Headlights on wet asphalt. The radio off because I needed to think, and the silence was better company than anything on the dial. I didn't know what I was going to say to Lorraine. I knew what I wasn't going to say. I wasn't going to accuse. I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to stand on her porch and give her the one thing nobody else had offered her in 4 years: permission to stop lying. I pulled into her driveway in Easton just as the porch light came on. She must have seen my headlights through the front window, because by the time I reached the steps, the door was already open. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a look on her face I recognized. Not surprise, not anger. The particular exhaustion of a woman who'd been waiting for someone to come ask the question she'd been dreading for 4 years. The smell of wood smoke and damp leaves came off the porch. The street behind me was silent. Lorraine looked at me the way you look at a door you've been leaning against for too long, and the first thing she said was the last thing I expected. I was wondering when you'd come. What she told me in the next hour would turn this from a family dispute into a criminal case. Lorraine told me things that night in Easton that I'll get to. But first I need to tell you what Ramona showed me the following week. Because the numbers came before the names. And the numbers are what made me understand that this wasn't a mistake or a lapse or a moment of desperation. This was an operation. Ramona Finch laid a 3-inch binder on her desk the way a surgeon lays out instruments. Precisely. Without hurry, and with the understanding that what came next would not be pleasant for anyone in the room. "I've completed the forensic audit," she said. "Everything in here is sourced directly from the bank's records. None of it passed through Simone's hands." She opened the binder to the first tab section. Spreadsheets, rows of transactions printed in small type, each one dated and categorized. I leaned forward and started reading. And the room got very quiet. 47 withdrawals, averaging around $2,400 each, over 4 years, each one between $1,800 and $3,200. Each one labeled with something that sounded official educational disbursement, trust maintenance, administrative processing, beneficiary support. Language designed to look routine. Language a bank clerk would glance at and approve without a second thought because the amounts were small and the authorization document was on file. I want you to picture 47 lines on a spreadsheet, each one a small enough number that nobody would look twice, and then I want you to add them up. Ramona did it for me. The total redirected from Wren's trust over 4 years is approximately $112,000, she said. The current remaining balance is $35,000. I sat there and did the math I didn't want to do. The trust had held close to $147,000 before Simone started. 13 years of commissions from custom furniture. 13 years of birthday deposits. 13 years of working past retirement because I believed the money would matter to a little girl I loved more than anything I'd ever built with my hands. And now, 3/4 of it was gone. "That's 13 years of my life on that page," I said. "Every commission check, every birthday deposit, every hour I worked past 60 because I thought it mattered." "It did matter, Mr. Stanton," Ramona said. "That's why we're sitting here." She turned to the next section, the destination accounts. This was where the money had gone, not into some offshore shell or anonymous holding, into personal bank accounts, checking accounts, savings accounts, accounts held by people with names. The withdrawals weren't going to strangers, they were routed to accounts held by Simone's own relatives, her mother's checking account, a savings account in a cousin's name, a joint account that listed Simone and Lorraine Prescott together. She hadn't built her operation in the shadows. She'd built it in her own family, using their accounts as waypoints. The way someone moves furniture through a series of rooms to make it look like it was always there. She'd taken that trust fund apart the way termites take apart a house. From the inside, one small bite at a time, until the structure that looked solid from the outside had nothing left holding it up. Ramona let me sit with it. She didn't rush. She'd done this before. Sat across from someone whose life had just been rearranged by a spreadsheet, and she knew that the silence afterward was part of the process. Then she turned back to the first page of the binder and pointed to the very first entry, the oldest withdrawal, June 2020. "This entry here," she said. "Does it look familiar?" $340, administrative processing. The same one I'd found on the old statement in October of last year, the one Simone had explained away as a routine bank fee. "That's the one she told me was a bank fee," I said. I accepted her explanation without thinking twice. Ramona nodded. That was her proof of concept. Long before there was ever a forged power of attorney on file, she tested how far a smile and an explanation could carry her. She picked an amount small enough that you wouldn't question it, and a label boring enough that the bank wouldn't flag it. You accepted it. Nobody at the bank blinked. And she filed that away for later, once she had a document to hide behind. Every dollar she took after that first withdrawal was built on a single moment. The moment I chose to believe her instead of looking for myself. She'd handed me a lie the size of a rounding error, and my acceptance of it gave her permission to take everything else. I closed the binder. The smell of printer toner and old leather filled the room. Broad Street traffic hummed through the window. I could feel the weight of that binder on the desk, the way you feel the weight of a verdict before the judge reads it. Ramona gave me a moment, then she said something I wasn't ready for. The relatives those accounts belong to. I need to ask you something. She turned to the destination section and pointed to one of the account names. Does this person match anyone you know in Simone's family? I looked at the name printed next to a checking account that had received 14 of the 47 transfers. 14 deposits over 3 years, each one arriving within days of a corresponding trust withdrawal. The name on the account was Lorraine Prescott, the woman whose door I'd stood on 2 weeks earlier. The woman who'd told me she was wondering when I'd come. The woman who'd grabbed my arm at Thanksgiving and sworn she didn't know anything. Her name was on the paper trail, and the woman I'd been driving to see for answers was already part of the infrastructure that made the theft possible. Lorraine's involvement in the paper trail was a question I'd have to answer later. Right now, the folder on my passenger seat held everything I needed, and I was done waiting. I didn't call ahead. I drove straight from Ramona's office to Garrett's apartment in Allentown with the evidence folder on the seat beside me and a feeling in my chest like I was carrying a match into a room full of gasoline. I knew what I was about to do to my son's marriage. I also knew what his wife had already done to his daughter's future. One of those things was fixable. The other wasn't. Garrett opened the door, looking surprised. Simone was behind him in the kitchen, a dish towel over her shoulder, something with garlic still warming on the stove. Normal. Domestic. The kind of scene you'd see through any apartment window on a Tuesday night. Except I had a folder that was about to tear through it like a saw through drywall. Dad, you should have called. We're just finishing dinner. I need to sit down with both of you, I said, right now. Something in my voice made him step aside. Simone came out of the kitchen drying her hands, and I watched her eyes drop to the folder in my hand. For 1/2 second, her face went blank. Not confused, not curious, blank. The look of someone who recognizes the shape of the thing they've been afraid of. I sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner a year ago, watching Lorraine's fork freeze in midair. I opened the folder and laid 3 documents flat on the surface. The forged power of attorney, the forensic examiner's report, and the transaction summary showing 4 years of withdrawals routed to accounts in her family's names. I've confronted people over bad wiring and late payments for 36 years. But nothing in my life prepared me for sitting across a kitchen table from someone who forged my name and watching her try to explain it away. Simone looked at the papers for about 10 seconds. Then she looked at me. I don't know what this is, she said. Her voice was steady, practiced. I've never seen these numbers before. Someone at that bank made a mistake. I didn't say anything. I just tapped the forensic report with my finger. Her eyes moved to it. She read the first line, and the steadiness left her face like water draining from a sink. When she looked up again, she was crying. Fine, I borrowed from it. I was going to put it back before Wren turned 18. It was a loan, not theft. I was drowning. Gene and nobody was helping me. You forged my signature. Simone. You didn't borrow anything. You took it and hoped I'd die before I noticed. You're twisting this. You're making it into something criminal when it was a family matter. I was managing that fund, and I made mistakes. And now you're going to tear this whole family apart over mistakes. 3 stages in under a minute. Denial, then reframing, then turning the accusation on me. I'd watched her do the same thing at that park in September when Wren mentioned the papers, the same smooth pivot, the same redirection. Except this time, she didn't have a child to send to the swings. There's a particular kind of silence that fills a room when a man realizes the person he chose to build a life with has been dismantling someone else's life. And that silence is heavier than any argument. Garrett hadn't moved. He stood at the end of the kitchen counter, with his hands gripping the back of a chair, his knuckles white against the wood, staring at the documents on the table. He hadn't looked at me since I'd opened the folder. He hadn't looked at Simone either. He was reading. The transaction dates, the dollar amounts, the account names. Simone must have felt the room shifting, because she turned to him and reached for his hand. "Baby, you know me. You know I wouldn't do this. Your father is making this into something it's not." Garrett didn't take her hand. He looked at it hanging in the air between them like it belonged to someone he hadn't met yet. Then he looked at her face, and I watched my son see his wife clearly for the first time. What do you do when your son won't take his wife's hand, not because he's angry, but because he's not sure anymore whose hand it is? 3 different answers, Garrett said quietly. Wednesday night, when the paralegal called, I asked you one question about the trust, and you gave me 3 different answers in 5 minutes. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who'd been doing his own math since that phone call and had arrived at the same number I had. I sat in bed that night trying to figure out which one of them was true. Now I know. None of them were. Simone's face changed. The performance fell away like plaster off a wall, and underneath it was something raw and frightened. She started crying then, not the controlled tears from a minute ago, but real ones, the kind that come when the person underneath finally breaks through. "I did it for us," she whispered. But Garrett was already looking at me, and the question in his eyes wasn't about Simone anymore. It was about what we were going to do next. And somewhere down the hall, a bedroom door was closed, and a 13-year-old girl was on the other side of it, and neither of us knew how much she'd heard. Wren's door stayed closed that night. I don't know how much she heard. I don't know if the walls were thick enough, or if she pressed her ear to the wood the way children do when the adults in their lives start breaking apart. What I know is that my son looked at me across that kitchen and asked a question without saying a word, and I answered it the same way. What happened next is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Not because of what Simone said, but because of what my son finally didn't. Garrett turned to Simone. He was still gripping the back of that kitchen chair, and when spoke, his voice was low and level and carried the kind of weight you don't hear from a man who's been avoiding conflict his whole life. "I need you to stay at your mother's until we figure out what happened with the trust. I'm not asking." Simone stared at him. For a second, maybe 2, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been shock. Because in 3 years of marriage, Garrett had never spoken to her like that. He'd never spoken to anyone like that. My son had his mother's quiet temperament and my stubborn loyalty, but he'd always leaned harder on the quiet part. Not tonight. This is what he wants. "Garrett," she pointed at me without looking, "your father has been trying to control this family since before we got married. He's poisoned you against me with a folder full of lies." Watching your son stand up to the person who's been taking his family apart is like watching someone pull a nail out of a board they built themselves. It has to come out, but the hole it leaves is permanent. "The folder didn't give me 3 different answers about the same paperwork on Wednesday night," Garrett said. "You did." Simone's jaw tightened. She looked at the documents still spread across the table, the forged POA and the transaction summary and the handwriting expert's report. And for a moment I thought she was going to grab them and tear them up. She didn't. She turned back to Garrett and changed tactics the way I'd watched her change tactics before, fast, fluid, without a seam showing. "I was scared," she said. "I gave you confused answers because I was terrified of losing you. That's not lying, that's panic. The forensic examiner says the signature isn't Dad's. Forensic examiners can be wrong." "Simone, stop." The kitchen went quiet. The garlic smell from dinner hung in the air like it didn't know the evening had changed. The clock on the wall ticked 3 times. Before I tell you what Simone said next, the words that almost changed everything, I need you to understand what this moment cost my son. He wasn't just confronting a lie. He was watching the life he'd built with this woman collapse one sentence at a time. And he was doing it in front of his father, which meant he couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. Before I reveal her final plea, are you still with me? Comment whether you think what Simone says next is genuine or one last performance. And tell me why in a few words. A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. Simone stopped arguing. The attack drained out of her face like water leaving a basin. And what was underneath was something I hadn't seen before. Not the polished CPA. Not the warm daughter-in-law who brought flowers to Constance's grave. Not the woman who'd smiled at me across a hospital room the day Wren was born. Something smaller. Something frightened. She took Garrett's hands. He let her, and I watched his fingers stay limp in hers. "Everything I did," she said, "all of it, was because I loved this family. I was drowning, and I made a mistake, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" Garrett looked down at their joined hands. He didn't pull away. He didn't squeeze back. He held them the way you hold something you're about to set down for the last time. Love doesn't forge someone's father's name on a legal document. Simone, I don't know what that is, but it's not love. My son had been patient his whole life, with me, with his mother's illness, with a wife who turned that patience into a weapon. That night, he finally learned the difference between patience and permission. Simone cried. Real tears this time, the kind that come without sound and leave tracks on a face that stopped performing. She packed a bag in the bedroom while Garrett and I stood in the kitchen not speaking. The zipper on the overnight bag sounded like a sentence ending. When she came out, she didn't look at me. She looked at Garrett one more time, and whatever she saw made her walk out the door without another word. I watched her taillights disappear down the apartment complex road. She was driving to Easton, to her mother's house. To Lorraine Prescott, the same woman whose name I'd seen on 14 bank transfers that afternoon. The same woman who'd grabbed my arm at Thanksgiving and whispered that she didn't know anything. Simone was going to the one person who knew everything and had been lying about it for 4 years. 3 days later, Lorraine showed up at my front door in Bethlehem, alone, uninvited, and ready to talk. Lorraine showed up 3 days after Simone drove to Easton. 3 days of her daughter under her roof, and whatever passed between them was enough to put Lorraine in her car and send her to my front door in Bethlehem. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. 3 sharp raps that sounded like someone who'd been sitting in the driveway rehearsing what to say and was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she waited any longer. I opened the door and found Lorraine standing on my porch with her coat unbuttoned in the cold and her eyes the color of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days. "I need to tell you something. Eugene. And if I don't do it right now, I'll go home and convince myself I shouldn't. Come inside. Lorraine." She sat at my kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood, the same table where I'd signed the trust paperwork years ago. I was beginning to understand that people put their hands flat on tables when they need something solid underneath them before the ground shifts. I made coffee. Neither of us drank it. The December light came low through the window, and Lorraine took apart 4 years of silence, one sentence at a time. I want you to sit with what she was about to tell me, because this is the part of the story where I learned that the person I'd been angriest at, besides Simone, was also a victim. "She told me in 2021, Lorraine said, right after your wife passed, called me late one night, crying, said she'd made a mistake with the trust paperwork. Did she'd used your name on a form to get access because you were grieving and she didn't want to bother you during the funeral arrangements? She said it was a shortcut, that she'd get it corrected once things settled. And you believed her." "I wanted to believe her. She's my daughter. I raised her alone after her father left when she was 4. Every mistake she made, I told myself it was because I'd failed somewhere, so when she said she'd fix it, I let her. Lorraine's voice cracked, steadied, cracked again. She told me how Simone called her panicked after that first small withdrawal went through, saying she needed Lorraine's checking account to temporarily hold funds being moved between trust accounts. Temporary parking, Simone called it. Just until the paperwork caught up. What do you do when a mother tells you she chose her daughter over the truth, and you can see in her face that it's been eating her alive ever since? My account, Lorraine said. She said it was just temporary, that the money would go right back. I didn't ask enough questions. I was her mother, and I chose to trust her over checking. 14 transfers over 3 years, landing in Lorraine's checking account and moving on to wherever Simone needed them. Lorraine told herself each time would be the last. Simone promised repayment. Simone promised the trust would be whole before Wren turned 18. The promises got larger as the amounts grew, and Lorraine kept her mouth shut, because opening it would mean admitting her daughter was a thief and she'd helped. I sat at your Thanksgiving table last year, she said, and you mentioned the trust, and I couldn't breathe. I looked at that little girl eating cranberry sauce, and I thought about what her mother had done to her future, and I nearly told you right there. But Simone was 3 feet away, and I was more afraid of my daughter than I was ashamed of myself. She said those 7 words then, and I heard in them the sound of a woman who had been drowning in silence for 4 years and had just broken the surface. I'm sorry, Eugene. I chose the wrong person to protect. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. The coffee went cold. Lorraine sat with tears running down her face without sound. And I sat across from her and let the anger I'd been carrying since I first saw her name on those bank transfers rearrange itself into something more complicated. She hadn't been a co-conspirator. She'd been another person Simone had made lies feel reasonable to. She stayed for another hour. By the time she left, I knew the full shape of it, the gambling debts that started the spiral. The online investment schemes that made it worse, the promises Simone made and broke and made again, each one larger than the last. But the thing that stayed with me after Lorraine drove back to Easton wasn't the money or the motive. It was what she said at the door, buttoning her coat with hands that trembled. She's my daughter, Eugene, and I love her. But I can't watch her destroy your granddaughter's future to fix her own mistakes. The next morning, I called Ramona Finch and told her we had a witness, Simone's own mother, ready to testify. Ramona took the call the next morning. I told her about Lorraine's confession, and she asked me to get Lorraine on speakerphone that afternoon. The hardest part of this story wasn't learning what Simone had done. It was deciding how much of it to tell a 13-year-old girl whose mother was the one who did it. Lorraine came back to my kitchen that afternoon, and Ramona's voice filled the room through my phone on the counter. For the next hour, Lorraine laid out the full timeline of her daughter's spiral, while Ramona cross-referenced it against the transaction ledger in real time. It started with online gambling in 2020, small amounts at first, poker apps and sports betting platforms that promised easy returns. Simone lost more than she won, which is how those things always work, and each loss drove her back for one more try. When the gambling debts mounted, she shifted to high-risk investment apps, the kind that advertise on social media with screenshots of fake portfolios. She lost there too, and every loss required another withdrawal from Wren's trust to cover the hole. The withdrawal spikes in March and August of each year match exactly what we'd expect from someone chasing losses, Ramona said through the speaker. This wasn't impulsive, it was cyclical. She was feeding a pattern. She kept saying she'd win it back, Lorraine said, her voice thin. Every time. She'd call me crying, swearing it was the last time. It never was. I want to be careful here, because a story like this can make a woman sound like a monster. And Simone wasn't a monster. She was a person who made one bad choice and then spent 4 years making worse ones to cover it. Each withdrawal was supposed to be the last. Each promise to Lorraine was sincere in the moment. But desperation has its own gravity, and once you start falling, stopping requires something more than good intentions. Ramona confirmed what I already suspected. The case was airtight for civil restitution and strong enough for a criminal fraud referral. Lorraine's testimony, combined with the forensic evidence, left no room for a defense built on misunderstanding or family disagreement. That evening, after Lorraine drove home and the kitchen was quiet again, I did the thing I'd been dreading most. I brought Wren to my workshop. She'd come over with Garrett for dinner, and after we ate, I asked her to sit with me in the shop, the same room where I'd written the first check. The workbench still smelled like red oak and linseed oil, unchanged in 13 years, and Wren sat on the stool Constance used to sit on when she'd watch me work. Telling a child that the person who gave them life is also the person who stole from their future is not something any grandfather should have to do. And I hope none of you ever have to. I'm not going to lie to you or soften this. Wren, your mother made some choices with money that I put away for your future. She took a large portion of it over the past 4 years. We're working to fix it, and we're going to court to get it back. But I needed you to hear it from me first. Wren sat on that stool with her hands in her lap, looking at the workbench. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough for me to hear the furnace kick on in the basement and the December wind push against the shop window. When she finally spoke, she didn't cry, she didn't yell. She asked a question that told me she'd been assembling her own understanding of this family's fracture for longer than any of us realized. Is that why I stopped seeing you so much? Because she didn't want you to find out? The words hit me harder than anything Ramona had shown me in that binder. My granddaughter had spent years watching the visits disappear. The Sunday calls go quiet, the excuses pile up, and she'd been doing the same math I'd been doing. She just hadn't had anyone to show her the answer. Yes, I said, that's why. She nodded. Not the way a child nods when she doesn't understand. The way a person nods when the last piece of something they've been building in their head finally clicks into place. I want to help you, Grandpa. If I need to tell someone what that money means to me, I will. The child I'd held in this workshop doorway 13 years ago, 6 pounds and furious at the world, was now standing in that same workshop telling me she was ready to fight for her own future. She was 13 years old, and she had her grandmother's eyes and her father's quiet loyalty and something else entirely that belonged only to her. Wren hugged me, and for a moment she smelled like sawdust and school and everything I'd been fighting to protect. When she pulled back, she looked at the workbench where I'd written the first check and said something that made me grip the edge of that bench to keep standing. You started this here. We'll finish it together. I called Ramona the next morning and told her we were ready to file. Lorraine would testify. The forensic evidence was locked down. And if the court would allow it, a 13-year-old girl wanted to speak about what her future was worth. In January, the lawsuit hit the courthouse, and Simone's response proved she wasn't done fighting. The lawsuit was filed on a Monday morning in January, and by Friday, Simone had hired a lawyer I'd never heard of and fired back with a defense that would have worked if we hadn't been holding something her attorney didn't know about. Ramona and I drove to the Northampton County Courthouse in Easton on a morning so cold the courthouse steps had salt crystals on them that crunched under our shoes. The building smelled like old stone and floor wax, and our footsteps echoed off the marble lobby walls in a way that made everything feel larger than it was. Emona carried the filing in a leather portfolio, and I carried 13 years of anger in my chest and tried to keep my hands from shaking. The complaint demanded full restitution plus interest, appointment of an independent financial trustee for the remaining balance, and a criminal fraud referral to the Northampton County District Attorney. The clerk stamped it, logged it, and handed back our copy with a docket number that made the whole thing real in a way that nothing before had. This was no longer a family argument. It was a matter of public record. It's done, Ramona said in the lobby afterward. "Once this is on the docket, there's no pulling it back. Are you still good with that?" I was good with it the day I saw my name in handwriting that wasn't mine. There's a particular feeling that comes with making your family's worst moment a matter of public record. It's the feeling of choosing truth over dignity, and hoping the truth is worth what the dignity cost. Walking out of that courthouse, I thought about Constance. She'd have hated every minute of this, the lawyers, the filings, the family name on a court docket for anyone to read. But she'd have been the first one through the door. The court accepted the case on expedited review. The forensic handwriting evidence was strong. Lorraine's sworn preliminary statement was stronger. We had a timeline, a transaction ledger, and a motive laid bare by the woman who'd carried the secret longest. By every measure I could understand, we were in a strong position. Then Simone fired back. Dale Whitmore was a civil litigation attorney out of Easton, with a reputation for turning financial disputes into procedural quagmires, exactly the kind of lawyer you'd hire when the facts aren't on your side. Within days of our filing, Whitmore submitted a response that was polished, aggressive, and smart enough to make my stomach drop. His argument had two prongs. First, the power of attorney was legitimate, properly executed and voluntarily signed. Second, and this was the one that worried me, I lacked fiduciary standing to challenge trust administration decisions because the POA had transferred that authority. I'll be honest with you, when I read Whitmore's filing, my stomach dropped. Because for about 10 minutes I thought we might lose this on a legal technicality, even though every word we'd said was true. If the POA were genuine, his argument would hold. A legitimate power of attorney really does transfer decision-making authority. And standing really is a threshold question that courts take seriously. I sat in Ramona's office on Broad Street reading the response, and for the first time since I'd walked into Lehigh Valley Savings 8 months earlier, I felt the ground shift under me. Ramona read the same filing. She set it down on her mahogany desk, and she smiled. "Whitmore's good," she said. "He's trying to make this about fiduciary standing instead of forgery. If the POA were real, this argument would actually work." But the POA isn't real. No. And they don't know we have one more card. She opened a folder I hadn't seen before. Not the evidence binder, not the forensic report, something new. She pulled out a single page and laid it on the desk between us. Ramona had been sitting on that document for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment, the moment Simone's lawyer staked everything on the POA being real. It was a printout from Lehigh Valley Savings' internal compliance system, dated 3 years earlier. A flag on Wren's trust account for suspicious withdrawal patterns for same-amount transactions in 60 days that had triggered the bank's automatic alert. Case number 4471C. The flag had been opened, investigated, and then closed after additional authorization documents were submitted. Documents that, according to the bank's own records, bore my signature. "She didn't just fool you," Ramona said. "She fooled the bank's own fraud detection system. The bank caught her 3 years ago. Their compliance system flagged the account and started an inquiry. And Simone shut it down by submitting more forged paperwork, a notarized authorization letter with your name on it that she created specifically to defeat the alert." I stared at that compliance printout. The bank's system had worked. It had done exactly what it was supposed to do. And Simone had beaten it with another forgery, built on top of the first one, layered like a wall. "Once the judge sees this," Ramona said, "the standing argument collapses. You can't claim a POA as legitimate when the defendant created a second forged document to defeat a fraud investigation into the first one. Whitmore's entire defense is built on a foundation we're about to pull out from under him. That single page would become the most important exhibit at trial. The proof that Simone's scheme wasn't a mistake or a moment of desperation. It was a machine. And she'd built backup parts. That compliance printout changed everything. Not because of what it said, I already knew Simone was a forger. It changed everything because of what it proved about who she was while she was doing it. Have you ever wondered what happens when a bank catches a thief, and the thief talks the bank out of doing anything about it? Ramona laid the printout flat on her desk the following week and walked me through it line by line. Her finger traced the timeline printed in small typeface across the top of the page, and her voice dropped the way it did when she was about to say something that would rearrange the way I understood my own story. January 14, 2023, she read. Case number 4471C. The bank's automatic monitoring system flagged Wren's trust account for suspicious withdrawal patterns. 4 same-amount transactions within 60 days exceeded the internal threshold. The system generated a case file and assigned it to a compliance reviewer. She looked up at me over her reading glasses. The system worked, Eugene. It did exactly what it was designed to do. 3 years before you walked into that bank and asked Gloria Hewitt for a statement, the bank's own software caught the pattern and raised a flag. Then why didn't anyone call me? Because someone responded to the flag before the bank could reach you. You know what's worse than finding out someone stole from your granddaughter? Finding out the bank almost stopped it and the thief talked her way past the safeguard. With another piece of paper that had my name on it. Ramona slid a second document across the desk, not the original forged POA, something else. Something I'd never seen and never imagined existing. It was called an authorization continuance letter, 1 page, typed, dated 3 days after the compliance flag was opened. It bore my name, my forged signature, and a notary stamp that Ramona's investigator had already confirmed was fabricated. The letter stated that all prior and future withdrawals from Wren's trust were authorized as part of a family education savings plan, and that I, as the account originator, was fully aware of and approved the transaction history. The compliance case was closed within 72 hours of that letter being submitted. The flag disappeared. The withdrawals resumed. This isn't just a forged POA anymore, Ramona said. She had a contingency plan. When the bank caught her, she didn't stop. She didn't panic. She sat down and forged a new document specifically designed to shut the investigation down. That's not desperation, Eugene. That's infrastructure. Simone hadn't just picked the lock. She'd built a second key in case anyone noticed the first one was counterfeit, and she'd done it calmly, methodically, the way you'd organize a filing cabinet. While I was in my workshop building bookshelves and dining tables, she was in her office building a system to steal from a child. And when the system designed to catch her actually caught her, she built a tool to defeat that too. She built a system to steal from a child, I said. And now that system is going to convict her, Ramona said. Every layer she added is another count of fraud. Every backup document is another piece of evidence that this was calculated from the beginning. Dale Whitmore's entire defense rests on the claim that the POA was legitimate and the withdrawals were authorized management. But you don't forge backup authorization documents for things you believe are legitimate. She let that sit in the room. The office was quiet. Old coffee and leather bindings and the muffled sound of Broad Street traffic through the Victorian windows. I held the compliance printout between my fingers and felt how thin it was. 1 page, 1 flag, 1 chance the system had to stop her. And she'd beaten it with another forgery built on top of the first. I want you to understand something. When I say this was premeditated, I don't mean she planned the first theft. I mean she planned what to do when she got caught stealing. She had a response ready for the bank's fraud detection system, the way a chess player has moves prepared 3 turns in advance. And then she kept stealing anyway, for 2 more years, because the contingency worked and nobody ever checked again. Ramona closed the folder. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not confident, not strategic, but something closer to grim satisfaction. The look of someone who knows the fight is almost over and the other side doesn't realize it yet. "When we walk into that courtroom," she said, Whitmore is going to argue this was a misunderstanding between family members. And I am going to show the judge that his client built a factory for forgeries, and the bank's own records prove it. She paused. The mantel clock in her office ticked twice. But first, we need Lorraine on that stand, and Lorraine needs to decide if she's willing to end her daughter's life as she knows it. I thought about Lorraine sitting at my kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, crying without sound, telling me she'd chosen the wrong person to protect. She'd already made her decision, she just didn't know yet what it would look like, under oath, in a courtroom, with Simone watching from 10 feet away. The trial was set for February, and Lorraine was going to have to look her daughter in the eye and tell the truth. Lorraine's hand was shaking when she placed it on the Bible, and I realized I'd never seen her afraid of anything until the moment she had to choose between her daughter and the truth. February came in cold and gray, and the Northampton County Courthouse in Easton smelled like old wood and floor polish and the kind of recirculated air that hasn't touched the outside world in decades. Judge Margrave was a sharp-eyed civil court judge with 30 years on the bench and no patience for procedural theatrics. She called the courtroom to order at 9:15, and by 9:20, Ramona was standing at the lectern with her evidence binder open and her voice carrying the way it did when she wanted every person in the room to understand that what came next was not a suggestion. Ramona laid out the case the way you'd lay out bricks for a wall: the forged power of attorney, the handwriting expert's report confirming the signature wasn't mine, the bank statements showing the pattern of withdrawals over 4 years, and then the compliance printout, the one that showed the bank's own system had caught the pattern 3 years ago. And the defendant had shut the investigation down with a second forged document. "Your Honor," Ramona said, "the defendant didn't just forge one document. When the bank's compliance system flagged the account, she forged a second document to shut the investigation down. This is not a family misunderstanding. This is infrastructure." Dale Whitmore stood. "Objection. Characterization. The authorization continuance letter is consistent with standard trust management correspondence." Ramona didn't even turn to look at him. "Standard trust management correspondence doesn't require a fabricated notary stamp, Your Honor." Watching Ramona lay out those documents was like watching someone dismantle a building, not with a wrecking ball, but by removing one bolt at a time until the whole thing had no choice but to fall. Judge Margrave overruled the objection without comment. Whitmore sat down. Simone sat at the defense table in a navy blazer with her hands folded, and from where I was sitting, I could see the side of her jaw working, grinding. But her face showed nothing. Garrett sat 3 rows behind me in the gallery. He hadn't spoken to Simone in weeks. He sat rigid with his coat still on, like a man who wasn't sure he'd be staying long enough to take it off. Then Ramona called Lorraine. The clerk said the words and Lorraine repeated them, and her voice cracked on truth, but steadied on nothing but. She gripped the rail of the witness box with both hands and looked straight ahead. Not at Simone, not at me, just forward. "The way you look when you're walking into something you know will cost you and you've already decided to pay." "Mrs. Prescott," Ramona said, "when did your daughter first tell you about the withdrawals from Wren's trust?" "Late 2021, Lorraine said. "She called me at 11 at night and told me she'd taken money from the trust to cover gambling debts. She said she'd pay it back." "Did she?" "She never did." "And did she ask you to keep this information from Mr. Stanton?" Lorraine's fingers tightened on the rail. "She didn't ask. She told me if I said anything, I'd never see Wren again." I'd spent 4 years angry at Lorraine for her silence, and it took exactly 90 seconds of her testimony to understand that her silence had been its own kind of prison, one her daughter had built and locked from the outside. Lorraine hadn't stayed quiet because she was complicit. She'd stayed quiet because the alternative was losing her granddaughter entirely, and Simone had known that was the one threat Lorraine couldn't call a bluff on. Ramona walked Lorraine through each confirmation. The dates matched the bank records. The motive matched the forensic trail. The threat matched the pattern of control that ran through every piece of evidence like a wire through a fence. Lorraine's voice broke twice more, but she never stopped. The court reporter's keys scratched in the silence between answers. Then Lorraine looked directly at Simone. Across 20 feet of courtroom air, past the defense table, past Dale Whitmore's legal pad and Simone's folded hands. Lorraine looked at her daughter the way you look at someone you love and cannot save. "I kept your secret for 4 years because you held my granddaughter over my head," Lorraine said. "I'm done." Whitmore stood for cross-examination. He buttoned his jacket. He approached the witness box the way you approach a dog you're not sure about. "Mrs. Prescott, isn't it true that your relationship with your daughter has been contentious and that this testimony is motivated by personal grievance?" Lorraine didn't blink. "My relationship with my daughter ended the day I learned she'd forged a 66-year-old man's signature to steal from a girl who was 7 years old when it started. That's not a grievance, that's a fact." Whitmore had nothing after that. He asked 2 more questions that went nowhere and sat down. "I want you to picture this. A woman who'd spent 4 years lying, deflecting, and threatening. Sitting in a courtroom watching her own mother say every true thing she'd forbidden anyone to say, and having absolutely nothing left to say back. Simone looked at her mother across that courtroom the way you look at a door that just locked behind you, not angry, not defiant, just the flat recognition that the last person who might have saved her had chosen not to." The courtroom was silent for what felt like a full minute after Lorraine stepped down. Simone sat at the defense table with both palms flat on the wood, staring at the spot where her mother had been, and didn't move. Then Ramona leaned over to me and whispered, "There's one more witness, and she's 13 years old." My granddaughter walked to the witness stand in the same shoes she'd worn to her mother's last school conference. And I understood that the bravest person in that courtroom was the youngest one in it. I'd wanted to stop her. When Ramona first mentioned calling Wren, every instinct I had said no, don't put a child in the middle of this. But Wren had asked. She'd sat across from Ramona in her office 2 weeks before the trial and said she wanted to speak. And Ramona had looked at me and I'd looked at Wren. And the girl I saw wasn't the newborn I'd started saving for. She was 13, clear-eyed, and ready to say what needed saying. Ramona kept the questions simple. She didn't need complexity. She needed the truth in a voice the courtroom couldn't dismiss. "Wren, can you tell the court what you'd like to use the trust fund for?" "College," Wren said. "My grandpa started saving before I could even read. He wanted me to have something nobody could take away from me." Her voice was steady, not rehearsed steady the way a person's voice gets when they've thought about something long enough that the words come out clean. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at me, not at Simone. "Wren, did you ever see any documents related to the trust in your home?" "I found papers in my mom's desk when I was 9, she said. "I didn't know what they were then. I know now. They had my grandpa's name on them, but they weren't his. I'd spent 13 years trying to protect Wren's future with monthly checks and careful saving, and here she was, 13 years old, protecting it herself with nothing but the truth and a voice that didn't waver. My hands gripped the gallery rail so hard my knuckles went white, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Ramona asked one more question. "What would you like the court to know about this trust?" Wren looked at me, not at the judge, not at her mother, not at the lawyers. She looked at me the way she used to look at me across the kitchen table when she was small and wanted to know if she was doing something right. "I want this money used the way Grandpa intended," she said, "for my future. That's all I came here to say." Judge Margrave turned to the defense table. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness?" Dale Whitmore glanced at Simone. Then he looked at the 13-year-old girl sitting in the witness box, the girl whose trust his client was accused of draining, and something shifted in his expression. He set his pen down on his legal pad. "No, Your Honor." That was the moment I knew it was over, when even Simone's own lawyer looked at that girl and decided there was nothing left worth fighting for. How do you steal from a child for 4 years, forge documents to cover it, build an entire system of lies to protect yourself, and then watch that same child sit 10 feet from you and calmly explain what you took? I looked at Simone, and she was staring at the table in front of her, motionless. And I realized she had no answer to that question either. Judge Margrave didn't wait long. She reviewed her notes, adjusted her glasses, and delivered the ruling in a voice that was measured and final. The court finds that the defendant engaged in systematic fraud over a period of 4 years using forged documents to drain a minor's education trust. Full restitution with interest is ordered. An independent financial trustee will be appointed to oversee the remaining funds. This matter is referred to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite disbelief, but lived somewhere between the two. I will note for the record that the defendant's own fabricated documents created to defeat this bank's compliance safeguards constitute the most damning evidence in this case. The court finds that irony instructive. Simone had built her defense out of forged paper, fabricated paper designed to look like something it wasn't. And in the end, it was paper that buried her, because every forgery she'd created was now an exhibit with a letter next to it. And the letters spelled out a word she'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. Guilty. The gavel came down, and 13 years of saving, 13 years of checks written at a workbench in Bethlehem were finally protected by something stronger than my signature. The court reporter's keys stopped. The courtroom exhaled. Ramona closed her binder and set her hand on my shoulder, and for a moment, that enough. Outside, the February air hit my face like cold water. The courthouse steps were gray stone, and Garrett was standing at the bottom of them with his coat collar turned up against the wind. He didn't look at Simone when she walked past with Dale Whitmore. He looked at me, then at Wren, and he said 2 words I hadn't heard from my son in over a year. "I'm sorry." Wren took his hand before I could answer. She walked down those steps, holding her father's hand. And I stood at the top watching them and thinking that some things break so completely that the only way forward is to build something new from whatever pieces are still standing. Garrett signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in Allentown. And by Saturday, he was carrying boxes into a 2-bedroom rental on Linden Street in Bethlehem, 10 minutes from my front door. The aftermath of a verdict is not what you'd expect. There's no parade. There's no moment where everything clicks into place and the world rights itself like a ship after a storm. What there is instead is paperwork, phone calls, a son sitting across from you at a diner on Hamilton Street telling you he's ending his marriage, and the strange, heavy feeling of knowing that the justice you fought for came with a cost someone else is paying. "Everyone keeps asking when I knew," Garrett said. He was turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table, not drinking it. "I knew the day she couldn't give me the same answer twice about the bank statements. I just didn't want it to be true." "You're not the one who should be apologizing, Garrett." "Yeah, I am." He looked up. "Not for what she did, for how long I let it happen while I looked the other way. I'll tell you something nobody warns you about when the person who hurt your family is also the person your son married. The victory doesn't feel clean, because every piece of justice comes with a piece of your son's life attached to it." Garrett wasn't angry. He was past angry. He'd arrived at the place that comes after, the place where you stop defending the story you told yourself and start looking at what actually happened. He was filing for primary custody. He was selling the house in Allentown. He was 38 years old and starting over, and he was doing it without excuses. Saturday morning came gray and cold. Garrett's truck was packed with boxes, not many, because he'd left most of the furniture for Simone's lawyer to argue about later. Wren rode in the front seat with a backpack on her lap and her earbuds in, and I followed in my own truck with a bookshelf I'd built from scrap lumber in my workshop the night before. Red oak, sanded smooth. Small enough for a bedroom that would be smaller than her old one. The Linden Street apartment was on the second floor of a converted Victorian. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that fit one person at a time, a living room window facing east. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like cardboard and old carpet, and someone else's cooking from the unit below. Wren walked through every room in under a minute. She picked the bedroom closer to the front door. "It's smaller than my old one," she said. "Yeah, it is," Garrett said. "I like it better." She said it the way kids say things they mean without emphasis, without explanation, just the fact of it laid down like a stone in still water. I carried the bookshelf up the stairs and set it against the wall of her new room, where the morning light hit it. And Wren ran her hand along the top edge the way Constance used to run her hand along the dining table after I'd finished sanding it. 9 minutes. That's how far my son had been living from me the whole time. Not the 45 minutes of highway between Allentown and Bethlehem, but the distance that had been built between us with canceled dinners and unanswered texts and a wall made entirely of lies. I drove from my house to Garrett's new front door and timed it twice, and both times it was 9 minutes. And after 4 years of asking permission to see my own granddaughter, 9 minutes felt like a miracle. We unpacked until the light faded. Garrett stacked plates in the kitchen cabinet while Wren arranged books on the shelf I'd built. And somewhere in the third box, Garrett opened a box he'd packed without looking through carefully. Wren pulled out a recipe card. Constance's handwriting. Faded blue ink on a cream-colored card with a grease stain in the corner. Pot roast. The one she'd made every Sunday for 30 years. The one I'd eaten 1,000 times and never thought to memorize, because I'd assumed she'd always be there to make it. "Grandpa," Wren said, holding it up. "Sunday dinner this week." Garrett looked at the card, then at me. "She wants to make Constance's pot roast," he said, and his voice caught on his mother's name the way it always did. Sunday came. Wren burned the pot roast. Garrett opened the windows, and cold February air poured through my kitchen while smoke curled toward the ceiling. And for 20 minutes my house smelled like charred beef and laughter and something I hadn't had in 4 years, my family, in my kitchen, without anyone's permission. That table had been set for one since Constance died, and now it had 3 place settings and a scorched roast and the kind of noise that makes a house stop being just a building. After Wren went to bed on the couch, she'd refused to go home. Said she wanted to sleep where it smelled like Grandpa's workshop. Garrett stood at the sink washing dishes. He set down the sponge and dried his hands on a towel. "Simone called me yesterday," he said. "She wants to meet, just the 2 of you. She says she wants to apologize." He paused. "I told her I'd think about it, but I think you should be the one she talks to. What do you say to the woman who stole from your granddaughter when she asks you not to let that granddaughter hate her?" I thought about Garrett's words all week. Simone wanted to meet. Not at a lawyer's office, not at the courthouse, not at anyone's home. A coffee shop on Main Street in Bethlehem, neutral ground, early on a Wednesday morning in March when the place would be mostly empty. I said yes because saying no would have meant I was still afraid of her. And I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just tired. She was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in. She looked different, thinner, no makeup. Wearing a gray wool coat I'd never seen before, not the tailored blazers she used to wear to family dinners. Not the put-together version of herself she'd spent years constructing for the rest of us. She looked like someone who'd stopped performing, and I couldn't tell if that was honest or just a different kind of performance. She didn't stand when I sat down. She didn't smile. She wrapped both hands around a coffee cup she never drank from and spoke without preamble. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," she said. "I know you won't, and I know I don't deserve it. But Wren, don't let her hate me. She's 13. She doesn't need to carry that. I want to be honest with you. I sat across from the woman who forged my name and drained my granddaughter's future, and I didn't feel anger. I felt something worse. I felt tired, the kind of tired that comes when you realize hating someone takes more energy than you have left. And the only thing you want is to stop carrying the weight of what they did. I won't say a word against you to Wren, I said. That's not for me to do. But I'm not going to lie for her either. If she asks me what happened, I'll tell her the truth. That's fair. She stood. She pulled on that gray coat and buttoned it slowly, and she walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. The bell above the door rang once, and then the door closed. And I sat there for 10 minutes staring at her untouched coffee across the table from my untouched coffee, and wondering if what I'd just seen was something real or something practiced. I decided it didn't matter. The promise was real either way. 3 days later, I drove to Easton. I passed the exit for Lehigh Valley Savings on the highway and thought about Gloria Hewitt sliding that bank statement across the counter the moment the floor had dropped out from under everything I'd believed, and I realized I'd never thanked her either. But today wasn't for Gloria. Today was for Lorraine. Driving to Lorraine's house felt different than it had 6 months earlier. The night I'd driven there in the dark after Garrett cracked and told me the truth. That drive had been fueled by rage. This one was fueled by something quieter and harder to name. Lorraine's house in Easton had the same welcome mat it had always had, faded and slightly crooked. The screen door creaked when she opened it. She smelled like cleaning products and something baking banana bread. Maybe. The kind she used to bring to Constance's Sunday dinners. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "Come in," she said. We sat at her kitchen table. I told her what I'd come to say. What you did in that courtroom cost you your daughter. I know what that kind of loss feels like, and I didn't come here to pretend it was easy. I came to say thank you, and to help with the legal bills. I don't want your money. Eugene. Constance would have driven over here with a check and a casserole and not taken no for an answer. I'm just doing the check part. Lorraine and I had been on opposite sides of the same wall for 4 years, her silent on one side, me suspicious on the other, and it took a courtroom and a 13-year-old's testimony to knock the thing down. She looked at me across her kitchen table the way she used to look at me when Constance was alive, before all of this. When we were just 2 people connected by the marriages of our children and the birth of a granddaughter we both loved more than we'd ever figured out how to say. She took the check. She folded it once and set it under the sugar bowl without looking at the amount. At the door, she stopped me with her hand on my arm. Not a hug, not quite a handshake. Just her hand, firm and steady, holding me in place long enough to say what she needed to say. I didn't do it for thanks, she said. I did it because I was silent too long, and silence was the thing that let her keep stealing. Every day I didn't speak was another day she took from Wren. I drove home with the windows cracked despite the cold, and somewhere past the Freemansburg Bridge I called Ramona. I asked about the trust. The independent trustee has been appointed, she said. Restitution order is being enforced. The fund is being rebuilt. She paused. There's one more thing. The new balance, once restitution clears, will be enough for a 4-year state school and then some. Wren's going to college. Eugene. The last time I'd sat at a table inside Lehigh Valley Savings, a bank officer had slid a statement across the counter and shown me that my signature had been used to steal from my granddaughter. Now I was back at the same bank, signing new papers, with that granddaughter sitting beside me. Ramona had the documents spread across the table in neat rows: the trust agreement, the independent trustee designation, the beneficiary confirmation, the restitution accounting, every page clean, every clause drafted to make sure that what happened before could never happen again. I looked at those pages and thought about the last set of documents that had carried my name at this bank, the ones I'd never signed, and I made a decision. I read every number out loud. Not to the bank, not to Ramona, to Wren. "This number here," I said, pointing to the balance line. "That's what the trust holds now, with restitution and interest. I want you to know it the way I know it. No one should ever have to tell you what's in your own account." Wren leaned forward and looked at the figure. She didn't flinch. She didn't look confused. She nodded once, and then she asked a question. "What does the independent trustee do?" Ramona answered. "She makes sure no one, not your dad, not your grandpa, not anyone can move money without documentation that two people sign and a third person verifies. What happened before can't happen again." I read every number on that document out loud because I'd learned what happens when you trust the wrong person to handle the details while you look the other way and assume everything's fine. I'd spent 13 years writing checks at my workbench and trusting that the money was safe. And the lesson that taught me was simple and brutal trust. Without transparency isn't trust at all. It's just hope with a bank account. Wren pulled a notebook out of her backpack. Not a school notebook, a plain black composition book she must have bought herself. She wrote down the trustee's name. She wrote down the account number. She wrote down the balance. "I'm keeping my own records from now on," she said. "Grandpa keeps his in his workshop. I'll keep mine in my room." 13 years old, and she'd already built the habit I should have had from the beginning. I looked at her bent over that notebook, writing numbers in careful handwriting, and something tightened in my chest that wasn't grief and wasn't pride, but lived somewhere between the two. Ramona set 2 pens on the table, one for me, one for Wren. I signed first, my name, my real signature, on a document I'd actually read at a bank where the truth was finally on the record. Then Wren picked up her pen. She signed her name slowly, every letter deliberate, nothing rushed. I watched the way she formed her capital W and the careful loop of her lowercase n, and my breath caught. Because she wrote exactly the way Constance used to write. The same patient hand, the same pressure on the downwrote strokes. I'd forgotten that Constance had taught her to write at the kitchen table when she was 5, sitting Wren on her lap and guiding her fingers through the alphabet on lined paper. Some things survive the people who gave them to you. Watching Wren sign her name in Constance's handwriting broke something open in me that I didn't know was still sealed. The realization that my wife's careful hand had survived in the one person I'd spent 2 years fighting to protect. Gloria Hewitt processed the paperwork. She'd been at this bank the day I first walked in asking questions, and she was here now, on the other side of the same story, filing documents that put it right. "Everything is in order, Mr. Stanton," she said. "The independent trustee is active, and the account is fully secured." She paused. "I'm glad this worked out." "You're the one who showed me the statement," I said. "If you hadn't, none of this would have happened. I just did my job." Sometimes that's enough. How many years did we lose because the people who sensed something was wrong decided it was easier to stay quiet than to ask the hard question? Lorraine stayed silent for 4 years. Garrett looked the other way. I trusted without verifying. Every one of us paid for our silence in a different currency, and every one of us learned the same lesson too late. Except Wren. Outside the bank, the March air had the first thin warmth of a season turning. Wren stopped on the sidewalk and turned to me, and her face had the expression she got when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally found the words. "Promise me something," she said. "No more secrets. Not about money, not about anything. If something's wrong, we say it. I promise." She was 13 years old, and she'd already figured out the thing that took the rest of us half a lifetime, that silence isn't peace. It's permission. Every quiet day we let pass without asking the question we knew we should ask was another day the damage grew. Wren understood that. She understood it because she'd watched what silence cost her family, and she'd decided she wasn't going to let it cost her anything else. That evening, I drove home and pulled into my driveway and looked at the porch light. The same one that had been on the night I sat in my truck holding gifts no one wanted. It was on again now. But this time, Garrett's car was in the driveway, and through the kitchen window I could see Wren setting the table for 3. The dishes were done. Wren was reading in the living room. Garrett was in the kitchen arguing with the coffee maker, which had been making a grinding noise since Constance bought it 12 years ago and had never once won the argument. I stepped outside and sat on the porch swing because, for the first time in years, I didn't need to be anywhere but here. The March air was cool but not cold, that thin edge of the season turning when you can smell damp earth and something green starting underneath the last of winter. The porch light was on above the door, the same bulb in the same fixture, casting the same yellow circle across the same front steps it had lit for 30 years. 7 months ago, I sat in my truck in this driveway holding a gift bag and a birthday card and a text message that said, "Don't come." The porch light was on then too. But there was nobody inside waiting for me. I'd driven 45 minutes with presents Wren would never open, and I'd sat there in the dark with the engine running, trying to figure out how a man could build furniture for a living and not notice his own family was being taken apart piece by piece. I spent 36 years building things, tables, chairs, bookshelves, things designed to hold other things up. And it turns out the most important thing I ever built was a trust fund that someone tried to tear apart and a family that refused to let her. Not because we were strong, because we were stubborn, because Vernon said, "Go to the bank," because Ramona said, "File the suit," because Lorraine told the truth when it cost her everything, because Wren told the truth when she was 13 years old and didn't have to, and because Garrett stood on that courthouse steps and said 2 words that were harder to say than any testimony in any courtroom: "I'm sorry." Constance would have hated every minute of this fight, the paperwork, the waiting rooms, watching people she loved get hurt out in the open. But she never once looked away from a hard thing in 37 years, and she wouldn't have started with this, because she was a woman who believed you could love someone and still hold them accountable, and that the 2 things weren't contradictions, but the same thing said in different voices. The screen door creaked and Wren came out carrying a blanket. She sat down next to me on the swing and pulled the blanket across both of us, tucking the edge under my arm the way I used to tuck it under hers when she was small. "You're always taking care of everyone," she said. "Let someone take care of you for 5 minutes." 13 years old. The girl I'd started saving for when she couldn't read her own name was sitting on my porch swing, telling me to rest. I put my arm around her, and we rocked in the quiet for a while, and neither of us said anything. Because sometimes, the best conversations are the ones where nobody talks. Garrett came out with 3 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Wren, mostly milk, and one to me, and sat in the chair by the railing. "Mom would have loved this," he said. "Sitting out here, all of us, complaining about the coffee. She'd have made better coffee. She'd have made better everything." I still owed Vernon that lunch. I was thinking Sunday. You want to know what winning feels like when the fight is inside your own family? It feels like 3 mugs of bad coffee on a porch swing in March. Not celebration, not relief, just the ordinary privilege of being together without anyone's permission. No scheduled visits, no texts asking if today works. No excuses canceling what should never have needed scheduling in the first place. "Grandpa," Wren said, "if I take woodworking next year, will you help me with the projects? I've been waiting 13 years for you to ask me that." She leaned into my shoulder, and I could feel the weight of her against me, solid and real. And I thought about the first check I'd written at my workbench, $2,000, careful handwriting, the beginning of something I believed would last. It did last. Not the way I'd planned, and not without cost, but it lasted. Garrett took the mugs inside. Wren followed a few minutes later, yawning, carrying her notebook. I stayed on the porch. The street was quiet. A dog barked 2 blocks over and stopped. The porch swing creaked under my weight the way it had for 3 decades. If you take one thing from this story, take this. When someone tells you you're too much trouble for asking the question no one else will ask, that's how you know the question needed asking. Simone's text said I was too much trouble. She was right. I was trouble because I wouldn't stop checking the numbers, wouldn't stop fighting for a girl's future when everyone wanted me to sit down and be quiet. Trouble is just love that won't look away, and I'd rather be trouble than silent, because I learned what silence costs, and I will never be able to afford it again. I stood up and looked through the window. Wren was asleep on the couch with her notebook open on her chest, the one where she'd started keeping her own records. Garrett was reading in the chair Constance used to sit in. I left the porch light on that night, not because anyone was coming home, because everyone already had. I spent 4 years trusting the wrong person with my granddaughter's future. I ignored the signs. I let silence do the damage that no thief could have done alone. Don't make my mistake. When the numbers don't add up, when the answers keep changing, when someone tells you not to ask questions, that's exactly when you need to ask them. Silence isn't peace, it's permission. This family drama taught me that love without accountability is just a door left open for someone to walk through and take what isn't theirs. My life story became a revenge story I never wanted to tell. But I believe God placed me in that fire so I could walk out holding something worth more than money, the truth. Every family has secrets. Every family has someone who'd rather you stay quiet. But the ones who survive are the ones who speak up, even when it costs them. This is more than storytelling. This is a dad's true revenge, not through anger, but through refusing to look away. If this family drama touched something real in you, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have filed that lawsuit? Or would you have kept the peace? Share this life story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. These revenge stories and real-life story moments, they're what this channel is built on. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. This storytelling experience includes certain fictional elements added for narrative and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. What matters most is the message, and I hope this dad's true revenge reminded you that trouble is just love that won't look away. God bless you.